Mr Berger.
To speak on the Premier's recent apology to Victorians who have endured historical abuse and neglect in institutional care, and in doing so acknowledge the suffering of these Victorians have endured in the state of state institutional care, and acknowledge the experience of many survivors who have fought for so long to be heard. Over the course of a century, thousands of Victorian children were entrusted to the state and sent to orphanages, foster homes, children's homes, missions and other organisations at the time. These children were taken from their families due to what the state determined as neglect. More than 90,000 children were sent away to these places under the pretext of state care. What they experienced was anything but that. Instead, they were subjected to horrible abuse and neglect at the hands of these agencies, institutions and homes. Acting President, no one's story was the same. I recognise that categories are not overly helpful and words are not overly useful when talking about this. No one's story was alike. Acting President, there was physical abuse, emotional abuse. This ranged from physical abuse in the form of beatings to concerted efforts to humiliate children from natural behaviour. The Premier spoke to examples such as the bedwetting, where children were forced to wear their wet sheets as punishment, in instances of children being locked in closets, being starved or fed rotten food. It's gut-wrenching to hear testimonies, stories and other recounts of events from survivors. These cruel punishments that were inflicted on them. These places where children were sent were entrusted by the state to look after children in need. The children were considered the ward of the state, meaning that in many instances children were taken under the wing of the state and away from their parents. Behind these words was something more, something different. Because the reality is that many of these Victorians were taken away from their families because they were struggling to put food on the table and struggling to make ends meet. Many of these children belonged to single-parent households, born to a single mother. Rather than helping these struggling families, the state decided it knew better and determined that it was best to take the children away from them. The state then sent many of these children to institutions where they did not provide the love, care, the parental guidance we expect out of our parents or guardians. They were instead met with neglect. Children were not treated with dignity and love. Many survivors bear scars of their existences of abuse from their time in institutional care as children, and it saddens me to know that many are no longer with us today and never received justice nor recognition in their lifetime of what they endured. It is a shameful chapter in our state's history. The Premier noted that one of the most common phrases used by children in these stories of abuse was the word shame, and I echo the Premier's in emphasising to the victims and survivors and that the shame sits with us, not you. These Victorians have fought hard every day to deal with the enormous trauma that was inflicted upon them as children in their most vulnerable time. It was not something they could escape from. It was the mandate of the state that these children were their ward, and by law, the state enforcement agencies were to uphold their placement and retention in these institutions with a blind eye to the abuse at hand of the horrid conditions. It is our great shame that for so long that the state not only considered it reasonable, but instituted measures to enforce and uphold these practices. It did not matter if the child wanted to go back to their parents, nor did it matter if the parents loved and cared for their child the best they could. The state had legislated their separation, and that was that. There was no remorse and no justice. And when at the time came to leave, these children were left alone, no support, nothing. Often, as the Premier mentioned as well, children who had up until they had spent every waking moment of their lives scrutinised, controlled, policed and directed in totality were thrown back into the world with nothing more than the clothes on their back. They had endured hardship in these institutions under strict, brutal and humiliating control, with no liberty or choice in matters. And then there were, once old enough, sent out into the world with no preparedness or effort to help them. They were then forced to make their own way without guidance and direction. Many of these survivors are still suffering from that abuse. Acting President, last sitting week I attended the speech in the other place delivered by the Premier, an opposition leader and the leader of the Greens, and it was a moment that I will never forget. Between 1928 and 1990, this happened. I was alive for almost half this period, Acting President. This is not some distant memory, this is a living memory, and the people in the gallery, tears flowing with the living reminder of that. Many watched in live sites in Geelong, Ballarat and Sale, with 100 more online. and people like John and Maureen Ellis, who I read about in my research from this speech. Benita Colavas and The Guardian, who wrote about their experiences. John, aged 84, was too unwell to travel to Parliament to hear the apology, but I know he was listening at home. Acting President, in my research I also learned about the Forgotten Australians and Former Child Migrants Oral History Project. For those who have not heard of it, I would encourage you to do so. It is a remarkable project. It acknowledges that we cannot possibly know every perspective, so engaging in a small sample size. It goes to great depth on their stories. It is a history project that has been used to create many more, to tell stories that have been left untold. Acting President, these Victorians, as we know, were often kept in the dark about their family history. Survivors were forced on a journey to piece together their family history bit by bit, uncovering documents and records that were incomplete, poorly kept, censored or entirely hidden, all for the basic information of knowing what had happened to their families and why they had been sent there. And it's projects like this oral history project that will help bridge these gaps. The apologies to the Victorians will not undo the trauma and the hurt inflicted on them, but I hope that they know we are now finally listening. Saying sorry is not just about acknowledging, but ensuring something like this does not happen again. We as a state must do better going forward. We cannot let this type of ignorance that directed such policy come to command our laws again. These laws, which designated many of these children as wards of the state, was done with language of misguided moralising. The words care and child protection paint to these programs of compassionate efforts to help the neglect, yet they were very different from that. Acting President, we must do different. I do want to take a moment to draw focus on the state's redress program, particularly for terminally or critically ill. Hardship payments are often to those survivors in extraordinary circumstances. For eligible care leaders in exceptional circumstances, like those who are terminally or critically ill and who experienced physical, psychological and emotional abuse or neglect while placed in orphanages, children's homes, missions or other out-of-home care. It is vital that as a state we work day in, day out to make sure that these Victorians are listened to and supported as we work towards not just apologising but standing with every victim and helping them along the way. Acting President, these injustices were recent as the 1990, and I can't name all the victims and all of their circumstances and all of the abuse that they would have endured. Acting President, I'm glad to see colleagues of mine from all sides of the chamber coming together to apologise collectively for the harm and pain imposed by successive governments in the name of child protection. It is a legacy that we share collectively as representatives of the state, and we must apologise and act as a collective too. It is beyond politics. To the survivors who may be listening, my thoughts are with you. You should never have gone through that appalling treatment, and the fact that it went on for so long by the state and at the hands of the agencies and instructions is not okay. Thank you.